The US hit peak oil in 1971. The UK, with its North Sea oil, peaked in 1999. Australia peaked in 2000. So when will planet Earth reach peak oil? That depends on what's really happening here. The place that provides a quarter of the world's oil, the Middle East.
These governments have not let anyone in to verify how much oil they have for getting on for a quarter of a century. And in the 1980s, there was some really suspicious treatment of oil reserves data. Most of the Gulf countries increased their national proved reserves, supposedly, by, in some cases, up to double. And then ever since, the quoted figures have not gone down very much at all. I don't believe that for a minute.
The dissident geologists went back to original surveys to estimate total Middle East oil. They added world-known reserves and projections of all future oil to be discovered. That's how they calculated the world will reach peak oil in the next 3 years, if we're not there already.
2008, maybe 2009, certainly no later than 2010. That's the point at which we will no longer be living in a world with growing supplies of generally cheap oil, but instead living in a world of rapidly shrinking supplies of ever vastly more expensive oil. And that point of realization is going to come as a real shock. Then we will see world record oil prices. Who knows how high they can go.
So what does the mainstream think? The world's largest petroleum company is ExxonMobil, Esso. It employs 20,000 scientists to generate their own exhaustive data sets. In their Melbourne 3D seismography room, I meet Head of Exploration, geologist Dr. Doug Schwebel.
Okay, this is a three-dimensional image of the geology offshore Bass Strait in Victoria.
Doug acknowledges oil will run down eventually. He just vigorously disputes when.
Well, people have been predicting for over 100 years that we're going to run out of oil. It hasn't happened. We don't think it's going to happen in the near term.
Exxon calculates twice as much oil left in the world as the so-called early peakers, placing peak oil decades away.
I mean, we're talking at least out to 2030 with what we know today, and then potentially another 20 to 30 years beyond that with technologies that we can, envisage might exist. If we can improve technology by only 10%, then we can recover an additional 600, 800 billion barrels of oil.
If this majority view is correct, we have plenty of time for a smooth market-driven transition to alternatives via hybrid cars. Cruising in the balm of this reassuring future, it's tempting to dismiss the early peak camp entirely as a small bunch of vested interest doomsdayers. But it's not that easy. Petroleum giant Chevron is now running these startling advertisements. And here in Australia, some surprising people have come out in the early peak camp. Earlier this year, Eric Streitberg asked an extraordinary question at the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association conference.
I asked them to put up their hands if they thought that we had reached peak oil. 50% of the people in the audience put up their hands saying that they believe we're at peak oil, and these are practicing petroleum industry professionals.
So what if they're right? This is what the early peak camp are terrified of. An apocalyptic gulf between dwindling supply and rising demand from the voracious East.
It's panic that causes collapses in markets. People start selling their shares. That's what happened in October 1929, and it just snowballs.
Rationing, people having to queue for 3 days to get a tank full of petrol, people not being able to afford to heat their houses.
Getting to $2 to $3 to $4 a litre, you really are grinding to a halt.
But couldn't we just switch to alternatives? like solar cars or hydrogen. Professor Peter Newman should know. He's been trying to prepare his hometown of Perth with a post-petroleum transport system, which includes Australia's first hydrogen buses.
This is a transition that can't be done overnight. Hydrogen technology is being developed, but it is a 20-year program.
20 years?
Yeah, the next 20 years are an absolute critical point where I don't know that we can make it. I just feel we haven't started soon enough.
The trouble is, if peak oil is imminent, then other mooted oil substitutes like biofuels, tar sands, shale oil could only yield a fraction of the world's needs. And no one can think of an alternative fuel for aeroplanes.
So I've looked at it all and I don't see a way of closing the gap quickly enough. That's the honest and depressing answer. It's all about renaissance. It's all about how quickly we can repair the problems and get an alternative infrastructure after the crisis breaks.
Whether we reach the end of cheap oil in 3 years or 30, it will be a defining moment for human society. Even if there's only a 1 in 10 chance the early peakers are right. With the lifeblood of our economy at stake, shouldn't we listen, just in case?
If people like myself are taking the view that they need to speak out, I think it's time to start taking it seriously.
We have lots of preparedness for terrorist attacks, but where's the plan for peak oil? We don't have one.
I think the interesting thing about the problem is that we'll find out who's right really soon. Within a few years, it'll happen and play out on our watch.